We can now move to the next topic, and I think we move now to the element of availability. And we have with us Mónica Diaz, who is head of supply and availability of medicines and devices in the e-agency. And Mónica is going to talk about monitoring of events and preparedness for public health emergencies. Thank you, Mónica, for being with us.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well, and we can see you.
Excellent. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be again here in your meeting to give you an update on where we are with our activities in the area of shortages and availability. So let's move then to the next slide. So I'll give you an update where we are with EMA's extended mandate and its implementation. Then I'll go through a case study, shortages of antibiotics that we experienced in the past autumn-winter. Then I'll just give you a flavor on the EC proposal for the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, and in particular, those aspects that have been included in the proposal to enhance security of supply of medicines. And of course, I will finalize with some concluding statements. So if we go to the next slide, and I think you've seen this before, so this is EMA's new role in the context of the extended mandate for the monitoring and mitigating of shortages of medicines in preparedness and during management of public health emergencies of major events. So this part of the mandate is applicable as of the 1st of March of last year. And we can say now that is practically fully implemented. So we are currently monitoring events, including shortages that may lead to crisis situations. We have set the processes and tools for reporting of shortages and also for coordinating responses to EU countries. There, of course, I need to mention that work is still ongoing on the development of the SMP. That the legislation foresees that should be fully operational by February of 2025. So we have a little bit more time and of course a main task ahead of us. Now, very important, we established last year already, so it's been in operation for now more than a year, the MSSG, the Medicine Shortages Steering Group, that as we explained before, formalized the executive steering group on shortages caused by major events that we set up during the COVID pandemic as an ad hoc structure. Now, we also have our working party of single points of contact in the member states. So this is formalized, the SPOC working party. And also we liaise with pharmaceutical companies, and we have that network of single points of contact for pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please. So this slide, I think you've probably seen already, but I think beyond EMA's extended mandate, is always important to give an overall picture of the coordination of activities at EU level when it comes to availability of medicines. And this is because we have quite a lot happening at the moment. And I think it's important to explain that all those different activities are being coordinated. We're ensuring that there are no gaps, there are no duplication, and there are synergies between them. So if we look on the left-hand side of the graph here, we're talking about the crisis and preparedness for public health emergencies or major events. So this is what I just referred to in my previous slide. So EMA's extended mandate, there we have the executive steering group on shortage and safety of medicinal products, the MSSG, which is an executive group. So in terms of composition, we have representatives from all member states, and it tends to be the head of the National Competent Authority, that is the member of the MSSG. We also have, of course, EMA, we have the European Commission, and we also have observers from the PCWP and the HCPWP. What does this group do? So it gives an opinion on a major event, if an event should be considered a major event. It adopts lists of critical medicines for crisis, for a public health emergency, and for COVID, and major events. So that was the case of COVID and monkeypox. And once we have lists of critical medicines for specific crises, it monitors shortages as well as supply and demand for those medicines that are included in the list. And the aim is, of course, to provide recommendations to the member states, the European Commission, and to industry, should that necessary to be to put any measures in place. Now, this MSSG, this executive group, is supported by, let's say, an engine, as we call it, which is the Medicine Shortages POC Working Party, which is the operational group that works not only during preparedness, but for a crisis, but during a crisis. Now, on the right-hand side, we talk about what happens in normal circumstances, so we can call it peacetime activities. And here, there is an important role for the HMA-EMA Task Force on Availability of Authorized Medicines. And I think you're also familiar with this task force, which is really a policy group that is been put in place already since 2016 to come up with more structural and strategic solutions to address supply issues. Here, this group focuses very much on the development of guidance and policy. And now, because of the very many activities that we have ongoing at EU level, it also functioned as a supply and availability hub where we coordinate the various activities within the steering committee of this task force. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you see this line, the Joint Action on Shortage, JASMINE. So this joint action has been put in place to provide capacity needed at national level for putting in place all these different activities that you see here on the screen. So, for instance, for the implementation of EMA's extended mandate at national level, so there are obligations for national competent authorities, and there was a need to provide the resources so that member states can fulfill their obligations under EMA's extended mandate, but also to fulfill the EMA strategy 225 and theme 1 on availability. So those different activities that are now being undertaken under the task force. And last but not least, of course, the pharma strategy and now the proposal for the new pharmaceutical legislation. Now, we work closely with the ECDC, in particular when it comes to them providing epidemiological models for forecasting demand. And last but not least, and very important, we work closely with DG HERA and DG Sante. Next slide, please. So just to give you very quickly a flavor of where we are with the implementation of EMA's extended mandate, and I will not go into very detail because I think you've seen this slide before and you know that we have the MSSG and the SPOC Working Party already in place for more than a year, as I mentioned, and we have established processes for reporting of shortages. Continuously, we monitor events, and we will come to the case study of the antibiotics. That was part of that process. We know, you know as well that we've established a list of critical medicines for COVID and monkeypox that are no longer applicable. So, and this as a result of the end of these two public health emergencies. And we were at the time matching supply and demand data for the medicines in these two lists, but that work has now ended with the end of the public health emergency. But I want to give you an update on where we are in relation to medical devices shortages. And as you know, there's also a role for EMA when it comes to this area, critical medical devices shortages. This part of the mandate is applicable as the 2nd of February of this year. So we had a little bit more time for implementation of this part of the mandate. And we have set up the MDSSG, so this is the equivalent to the MSSG, but for medical devices. So the Executive Steering Group on Shortages of Medical Devices, and its supporting working party. So the Medical Devices Shortages SPOC Working Party. So that has all been put in place, has been established. And we've also developed an IT tool for the reporting of shortages of critical medical devices, as well as supply and demand data. That IT tool, we started the development at the end of last year in November, and it's just been finalized, so it's in place. So when it comes to medical devices, this part of the mandate is only applicable during a public health emergency, not major events, and there are no preparedness activities foreseen for EMA. So we have set up the structures, the processes, and the IT tool. Everything is in place, and when we are faced with a new public health emergency, we will then action all those structures, processes, and the IT tool as well. Now, last but not least, and I think I've already addressed this in a previous slide, the European Shortage Monitoring Platform, the SMP. So it needs to be fully operational by February 2025. And we're working very hard towards the development of the platform to ensure that we meet the deadline in the legislation. Next slide, please. So now that the two public health emergencies have ended, but even before with the two public health emergencies still ongoing, we of course focus our activities on preparedness. And I just wanted to give you a flavor on how these preparedness activities work. So, and this very much reflects what we did with the shortage of antibiotics in the past autumn-winter. So at EMA, we work with industry associations, with individual pharmaceutical companies. We work with patients and consumers and healthcare professionals associations at EU level, and also with academia. We collect information on shortages to understand the situation in Europe. We look at the root causes of shortages. We see when we can provide regulatory support to pharmaceutical industry, and also we liaise with MAHs to see whether supply capacity can be increased in case of an increase in demand. And we also look into other measures to mitigate shortages. Now, this is what we do at EMA together with the SPOC Working Party, and we bring all this information for discussion at the level of the MSSG. Now, in parallel at national level, the NSA SPOCs in the national competent authorities, they too liaise with the stakeholders in the supply chain, all stakeholders in the supply chain at national level. So we liaise with the stakeholders in the supply chain at European level, and national competent authorities do the same, but with national associations. And they too look into information on shortages. They provide to EMA demand data and any other relevant data. All this is processed, discussed at the engine, as we call it, of the management of shortages, the SPOC Working Party, and then we escalate for discussion and for recommendations at the level of the MSSG. Just to mention as well that, of course, we work, as I mentioned before, we work closely with DG Sante and HERA, and you'll see for the antibiotics that we actually have started in February a joint exercise with DG HERA. Next slide, please. So in terms of the preparedness activities and also for the recommendations I'm referring to that the MSSG can put forward, what we're working towards is setting up a toolkit of measures that can be used to mitigate the impact of critical shortages. So perhaps to mention that in our preparedness activities, we focus on critical shortages. So those situations where there is no alternative for patients. And we've put together a set of measures that we separate in, let's say, different areas. So European international cooperation, others relate to communication, also measures related to regulatory flexibilities that can be put in place to mitigate the impact of a shortage. What we can do to increase supply of medicines when there is a very high increase in demand, and also situations where we need to control distribution to ensure that we mitigate the impact of the shortage for patients. So here on the screen you can see a large number of different measures that can be put in place to mitigate the impact of shortages. This toolkit has also been shared with the MSSG so that the individual countries can see, based on the situation in their country, they see what is the most, let's say, appropriate measure to put in place, taking into consideration their, the reality in their country, the situation in their country for that particular shortage, which can, of course, differ from country to country. Next slide, please. So I want now to address the shortages of antibiotics, in particular amoxicillin, that we've experienced in past autumn, winter. And I think I've touched upon some of the work that we did and the measures we put in place. So I'll go quickly through the initial slides and I'll focus on what we're doing to prepare for the next autumn, winter. So we were closely monitoring the shortages of antibiotics at the level of the SPOC Working Party. And this started as early as November of last year. We focused on amoxicillin and amoxicillin clavulanic acid, those shortages, because this was what our working party members told us that were the most critical shortages. We set up a dedicated subgroup of the SPOC Working Party that worked on a regular basis, looking at the causes for the shortage and the extent of the situation in Europe. Now, what we've realized is that most of the countries were affected by these shortages, in particular of pediatric formulations. And the root causes were an increase in demand, so an expected increase in demand due to high level of infections. There were also some issues related to manufacturing delays and production capacity issues, and I'll get to that. Next slide, please. So this was, as I said, discussed at the level of the SPOC Working Party, was monitored by the SPOC Working Party, but escalated to the MSSG. And so it was important to have that cooperation at EU level, but also internationally. So we had discussions with our colleagues at Sante and HERA to see what could be put in place to mitigate the impact of the shortages. And of course, we also exchange information with international regulators. And as you probably know, the shortage of antibiotics actually affected most countries globally, including the US and Japan and also Australia. So what we did earlier on is we engaged with the manufacturers to agree on possible mitigating measures. So we look at the key suppliers to the European market and we liaise with those companies. So we ask what could be done in terms of increasing manufacturing production and supply to the European market, and also if there was a need to put in place any regulatory flexibilities to ensure that increase in supply. As I mentioned before, the MSSG had this central role in sharing best practices, the toolkit that I showed you in the previous slide. We also had interactions with stakeholders in the supply chain, so we do that regularly, and I mentioned how we work in preparedness activities. And also we stressed how important it was for the member states to do that at national level. So it is done, perhaps not in all countries in the EU, so we encourage all MSSG members to engage at national level with their relevant organizations. Now, what we did as well is we had the so-called oral explanations from the MAHs, from the key suppliers of antibiotics to the MSSG, so that we highlight to them the criticality of the situation. And so to give a possibility for the member states to also talk directly with those companies. And we put in place a number of communication activities in relation to these shortages to reassure the public and also to promote rational use of medicines and shortage, which is very important in this case. And you probably remember that joint public statement that we published in January of this year. And we further enriched the MS shortage catalog with information for healthcare professionals and patients. Next slide, please. So I think now what is important is what can we do to prepare better for the next autumn winter. And what the MSSG agreed earlier on at the end of January, and this was also agreed at the level of HERA's board, was that we needed to put a number of activities in place to be better prepared for the next autumn winter. So we started this joint European level EMA-HERA jointly with HERA exercise, where we're looking at supply and demand for a subset of key antibiotics. So we want to understand if there will be any gaps and to understand that earlier on where we can put any EU coordinated actions to ensure sufficient supply for European patients. Now, we had to start earlier on with this exercise because the production of antibiotics, the lead times are quite long, so around 6 months. So it was important to collect this information as early as possible so that if there is a need for recommendations for the manufacturers, that we can reach out to them earlier on and there is still time to put measures in place. Next slide. So we've defined this subset of antibiotics that we felt was important to have them closely monitored. We had a number of discussions at the level of the SPOC, HERA board, as I mentioned, and the MSSG. And then we identified what were the key suppliers for each of those antibiotics. And then we reach out to the relevant companies asking for supply forecasts. In parallel, we've also looked at demand forecasts, and this was done based on modeling, taking into account historical consumption, so historical sales for this set of antibiotics, but we've also collected demand data from national competent authorities. Now we are in the process of matching supply and demand data to identify any potential gaps. And if needed, then HERA, together with EMA and other Commission services, will put measures in place, taking into consideration, of course, the recommendations that will be put forward by the MSSG. Next slide. So now I'll move on to the EC proposal for the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation and what is included in the proposal that hopefully will enhance security of supply of medicines. Next slide, please. So there are I would say two separate areas. One that relates to the monitoring, management of withdrawals and shortages, including critical shortages, and there is another chapter related to the security of supply. So when it comes to the management of shortages and also withdrawals, here we see a request for or change to the reporting obligations, and we have now a possibility to have early notification. So this is something I would think is important, that we are notified as early as possible about potential shortages and also withdrawals from the market. So those timelines have been extended. And this will allow us to prepare earlier on to mitigate the impact on patients, and if possible, when it comes to shortages, to prevent the shortages to actually materializing. Now, the new proposal focuses very much on this shift from a reactive approach to shortages to more a preventive approach. And it sets out this requirement for shortage prevention plans and shortage mitigation plans. So this is something that will be required for all medicinal products in the European market, and it will be available at the level of the pharmaceutical companies and will be have to be provided to regulators upon request. So it does not have to be submitted as such proactively, but it needs to be available upon request. Now, of course, we see as well in this proposal that our role in the monitoring management of shortages, EMA's role, in particular for critical shortages, is being strengthened, and we of course very much welcome that, and we believe there is a need for EU coordination, in particular for critical shortages. And also in terms of recommendations on measures to prevent or mitigate critical shortages. So here we see a strengthened role for the MSSG to put forward EU coordinated actions and recommendations, not only in a situation of public health emergency or a major event, but in a situation of a critical shortage. Now, when it comes to the security of supply, the proposal puts forward a requirement for the development of a union list of critical medicines and brings obligations for MAHs and other actors for those medicines. And again, the role here of the MSSG to come up with recommendations on appropriate measures to secure the supply for those critical medicines. Now, last but not least, and here at the bottom, we see that the proposal also foresees an expanded role for the SMP. So the SMP has been developed, and as per what is the scope set out and EMA's extended mandate, but the new proposal foresees that the ESMP will be expanded again, and similar to the MSSG, so the role will be beyond crisis, so public health emergencies, major event, and just preparedness activities for crisis. Next slide, please. So let me just now conclude. So we, EMA, we continue to coordinate and manage shortages of centrally authorized products and critical shortages of nationally authorized products. And this is done outside a public health emergency or major event. I explained the case study of the antibiotics. So this is done under the preparedness activities in EMA's extended mandate. As of early this year, February, we are also responsible for coordinating responses to shortages of critical medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics, but this is only applicable during public health emergencies, and there are no preparedness activities foreseen for EMA in the area of critical medical devices shortages. And I think very importantly, also to mention that under the task force, the HMA-EMA task force on availability of authorized medicines, we are already developing the union list of critical medicinal products. So I've just mentioned in my previous slide, this is foreseen in the regulation, but work is already ongoing. In terms of the IT development work for the critical medical devices, this is already in place, the IT tool, and for the SMP, it's underway to ensure delivery in early 2025, February 2025, in line with the requirements of the regulation. And last but not least, and as I mentioned, we have a close collaboration with the CDC for the epidemiological data that we so much need for forecasting demand, and also with the European Commission when it comes to data collection and also supply and demand data, and also the tools, so the SMP as well as the Athena, the IT tool that is going to be developed by DG HERA. So we work closely, almost on a daily basis, with our colleagues in the European Commission to ensure synergies, no overlaps, and also no gaps when it comes to the management of shortages. And I think this was my last slide, so happy to answer any questions that you may have.